So let's get into football. I'm answering a relatively controversial question today, that being the debate between putting Julian Edelman in the Hall of Fame and keeping him out. Those who argue for the Hall of Fame often point to his consistency, his clutch ability, Super Bowl MVP, and as well as the catch of Super Bowl 51. And another reason that they point to is the fact that Julian Edelman is arguably one of the most known receivers in the league. And that isn't necessarily a direct result of pure skill and ability. There's a big difference there between popularity and skill. Odell Beckham, arguably the most popular receiver in the NFL in terms of if you ask anyone on the street who's Odell Beckham, more often than not, they're going to say, oh yeah, he's an NFL wide receiver. Or he had that insane catch on the Giants. So there's a big difference there. I'm not saying that Julian Edelman has an insane amount of skill or athletic ability, but what I am saying is that he is one of the most known receivers in the league, and that is because of his spotlight he has been given with his great plays and performances in the Super Bowls that he has been in. His name being well known has more to do with his memorial Super Bowl and playoff performances that have allowed fans to remember the name. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, people tend to argue that the former Super Bowl MVP is not crucial to the NFL's story, and the quote, NFL story can be easily told without him. Those fans often argue that the Hall of Fame should be preserved for players that are a crucial piece of the NFL story, players such as Tom Brady, Peyton Manning, Julio Jones, Terrell Davis, just to name a few. It's extremely difficult to tell the story of the NFL without mentioning those names, as they each have played a crucial part in how the game is played today. I mean, the same problem comes, say, when you talk about a player like Frank Gore, who has also been in the same controversial debate in recent years. Arguably the most consistent running back in recent history in terms of production and longevity, yet can you tell the NFL story without him? Could you explain to someone in a several hour-long conversation the entirety of what the NFL is all about, how the game has evolved throughout its history, without mentioning Frank Gore? It's an interesting conversation. So to try and pin this down to pure facts, rather than this theoretical argument of the NFL story, let's compare Julian Edelman to other Hall of Fame slot receivers, or just receivers in general. Let's compare Edelman to Tim Brown, a receiver who has been the definition of consistent, with 9 straight 1,000-yard seasons and 10 straight 75-catch seasons. Those who argue for Edelman to be inducted into the Hall of Fame look towards his consistency, so let's compare consistency. The funny thing is that Julian Edelman has been insanely inconsistently consistent, and you'll understand why in a moment. If you look at his yard, touchdown, and catch totals, he seems hilariously inconsistent. Just looking at this, and I'm going to start kind of where his career kicked off in 2013, because before that, he was a really unknown receiver on the team. But in 2013, he gets 105 catches, over 1,000 yards, and 6 touchdowns. The following year, in 2014, 92 catches, under 1,000 yards, and only 4 touchdowns. In 2015, barely under 700 yards, 61 catches, and 7 touchdowns. In 2016, 98 receptions, 1,100 yards, and 3 touchdowns. In 2018, 74 catches, 850 yards, 6 touchdowns. And in 2019, 100 catches, 1,100 yards, and 6 touchdowns. So from an outside perspective, that's a really up and down. I mean, he starts at 1,000, drops all the way down to 700 at one point, back up to 1,100, down to 800 the following year, and then back up to 1,100. So very inconsistent, right? Well, this can kind of be immediately debunked by the fact that Edelman has struggled with an injury in a number of his recent seasons. In 2018, he suffered an injury. Or no, my bad. In 2018, he didn't suffer an injury. He was actually suspended for 4 games. Although in 2015, he suffered an injury. And in 2014, he suffered an injury. So there have been a few years here where you look at the 2018 season, those 4 suspended games could have easily gotten him to 1,000 yards. I mean, he was only 150 under. You look at 2015, he missed 7 games. Those 7 games, I think he could have gotten another 310 yards in 7 games. It's not impossible to do for a guy like him. 2014, he was only 30 yards under 1,000, and he didn't play in 2 of the games. I think he could have done that. So then we have to look at the game-by-game averages, the catch-by-catch averages, just the averages overall in order to really gauge how consistent Edelman is when he's actually on the field. Because once you look there, he seems insanely consistent, contrary to what we saw before. Again, I'm going to start where his career kind of kicked off. 2013, I'm going to go from 2013 to 2019 here, just straight all the way down. 10.1 yards per reception in 2013. Then the next year, 10.6. The next year, 11.3. Then 11.3. Then 11.5. Then 11.2. So only a range of 10.1 to 11.5 within the last 7 years of his career. That is insanely consistent in terms of yards per reception. Then you go to receptions per game, and it gets even crazier. 6.6, 6.6, 6.8, 6.1, 6.2, 6.3. Again, insanely consistent. Only a couple tenths of a difference there. You go to yards per game, 66, 69, 76, 69, 70, 69. Catch percentage, 69, 68, 69, 61, 68, 65. Yards per target, 7, 7.3, 7.9, 7.0, 7.9, 7.3. So based on those averages, Edelman has not insanely fallen off at any point in his career since it really kicked off, and he hasn't at any point really just boom and lifted off at any point in his career. He's been very, very consistent in terms of those averages. So when he's on the field for all 16 games, you can pretty easily gauge what kind of season he's going to have. So clearly, if the Hall of Fame was based solely on consistency, Edelman would be a solid candidate. Yet the problem is that the Hall of Fame is not simply based on stats or even production. Like I said before, it can also be based on how they have impacted the game. So, how has Edelman impacted the game? Maybe his stellar performance in Super Bowl 51 with 5 catches for 87 yards, along with the impossible catch that gave New England a first down mid-comeback. Maybe his Super Bowl MVP performance in Super Bowl 53. Maybe his touchdown catch in Super Bowl 49. Maybe his clutch consistency during late game winning drives, something Brady has always been up to and used Edelman for. But back to the initial question. Is Edelman a Hall of Fame candidate? One last point I'd like to make before I give you my final answer is that there is a reason this is a heavily debated question. There is a reason no one can settle on yes or no without a steep argument. I'd even say that the fact people are arguing about it just goes to show why he shouldn't be let in. Someone who's going into the Hall of Fame, it should be a given. It should be a given that they belong there, that they are at such an elite high level that they need to move beyond just their name being said in future statistic reads. They need to be somewhere where they will never, ever be forgotten. The Hall of Fame. And it has to be a given. Because if it's not a given, if you're going to start letting players in where an argument can be made for them not to get in, then it doesn't become as exclusive. It doesn't become such a golden palace of fame and remembrance. I mean, it loses some of its value if you let in players that aren't a given. I personally don't think a player should be allowed in the Hall of Fame if it's not a given. If there's still argument about it, then they haven't done enough to get in. So in the end, I'd have to say no. Not yet. Because his career is not over, just as his resume remains unfinished. Maybe if Edelman continues to play for multiple years, puts up a couple 1,000-yard seasons and clutch performances, maybe I could say yes for sure. But as long as it remains a clouded and unsure argument, Julian Edelman should not be inducted at all. Hall of Fame players should rarely need debate as to whether or not they should be allowed in.